welcome to Roots of Today, the podcast where the past meets the present. With every episode, we journey through time, uncovering the lessons, parallels, and connections between historical milestones and current events to create a deeper understanding of the compelling stories and issues that shape the news. In the United States, political power has always been counted, literally. From the moment the framers dipped their quills into ink and drafted Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, they established a system in which representation would not be apportioned by guesswork or political bargaining alone, but by an actual enumeration every 10 years. This was not an idle bookkeeping exercise. The census would decide how many seats each state commanded in the House of Representatives, how many electoral votes it wielded in presidential elections, and, later, how much federal funding it could claim. Behind the clean arithmetic of apportionment lurked an untidy truth. Deciding who counts means deciding whose political voice matters. From the original Constitution's compromise that treated enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, to the exclusion of Native Americans not taxed, to modern battles over the counting of undocumented immigrants, the census has never been a neutral act of head counting. It has been, and remains, a contest over power, representation, and belonging. Today, the debate has been resurrected one more time, and President Donald Trump seeks to conduct a census that excludes undocumented resident aliens from the count. It is a certainty that this case will end up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. The stakes are high, as Trump's plan would have a profound effect on the number of congressional votes for states like California, Arizona, New York, and Illinois, places with large populations of undocumented aliens. As always, this is Alan, your host, reminding you to grab your coffee, tea, or whatever your favorite beverage is and sit back, because we are going to take a hard look at the history behind the census and the fight over representation. There is a famous line attributed to Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin that goes, "It's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes." Today, we very much understand the second part of that equation, as the losing party has raised questions about voter fraud for the last several elections. Yet, because we are a representative republic, there is a third part of that equation Stalin never had to consider, and that is this. When it comes to apportionment, who is counted is just as important. The Supreme Court has long acknowledged this. In the 2016 case Evenwell v. Abbott, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the following for the court. Representatives serve all residents, not just those eligible or registered to vote. That single line distilled more than 2 centuries of census practice into a constitutional principle. Representation is tied to population, not just to the electorate. President Trump has once again thrust this old contest into the spotlight. Announcing his intent to conduct a mid-decade census that would exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment count, Trump reignited a legal and political struggle that has shadowed the census since its inception. Supporters framed the move as a correction to unfair boosts in representation for immigrant-heavy states. Critics called it an unconstitutional erasure of millions of residents. The Census Bureau itself warned that implementing such a change would be logistically unprecedented and politically charged. So, let us look at the political ramifications of such efforts, tracing the history of who gets counted and who is left out, from the Constitution's drafting to the present day. The census has always been a political instrument, and every attempt to alter its scope is, in effect, an attempt to reshape the nation's balance of power. The first census of 1790 was a modest affair by modern standards. U.S. Marshals on horseback traveled through the 13 states, tallying names in leather-bound ledgers. Yet, even in its infancy, the census was not simply a neutral accounting of inhabitants. The Constitution had already built into it a deeply political compromise over who would count. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Southern delegates demanded that their enslaved populations be fully counted for apportionment purposes, even though those individuals had no political rights. Northern delegates resisted, arguing that it was unjust to give Southern states more representatives based on populations that could neither vote nor participate in civic life. The resulting 3/5 compromise, enshrined in Article 1, Section 2, counted 3/5 of all other persons, a euphemism for enslaved people when determining representation. James Madison, in The Federalist No. 54, defended the formula as an unavoidable concession, writing, "The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves, when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property." This compromise, though pragmatic in the eyes of its architects, had enormous political consequences. It artificially inflated Southern representation in the House and Electoral College, shaping early U.S. policy in favor of slaveholding interests. By one estimate, without the 3/5 compromise, Thomas Jefferson would have lost the presidency in 1800. The extra representation awarded to the South effectively tipped the balance of electoral votes. The Constitution also excluded Indians not taxed from the population base used for apportionment. In practice, this meant that Native Americans living under tribal governance and beyond the reach of U.S. taxation were invisible to the census. This exclusion was rooted in a combination of sovereignty recognition and political marginalization. Congress did not view tribal nations as part of the political community entitled to representation in federal institutions. The exclusion remained in place until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and even then, census practice lagged. It was not until the 1940 census that Native Americans were consistently counted regardless of the tax status. By that time, decades of forced removal, assimilation policies, and demographic decline had drastically reduced their numbers, a stark reminder that exclusion from the count often coincides with political and social dispossession. Even in the early decades, political actors understood that manipulating the count could yield tangible benefits. Inaccuracies, whether accidental or deliberate, could change the apportionment map. In states where political power was tightly balanced, an overcount in rural counties or an undercount in urban centers could mean the difference between gaining or losing a congressional seat. The incentives to contest or control the census were baked in from the start. The Civil War destroyed the fragile constitutional compromise over slavery, but left unresolved the question of how political representation would be calculated in a union without chattel slavery. The Confederate States' readmission into Congress presented a stark problem. If formerly enslaved people were now free and fully counted for apportionment, Southern states would gain substantial representation, even if those freedmen were denied the vote. The framers of the 14th Amendment sought to address this by rewriting the constitutional formula. Section 2 declared, "Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed." The significance of the phrase "whole number of persons" cannot be overstated. It abolished the 3/5 compromise outright, mandating that all persons, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, be counted equally. During the debates in 1866, Representative James Blaine of Maine was explicit. "Numbers, not voters, are the basis of representation," he stated. Michigan Senator Jacob Howard emphasized that the whole immigrant population, citizen and alien, with the exception of untaxed Indians, is included. In other words, Congress deliberately chose a broad definition of persons that encompassed non-citizens and those ineligible to vote. The amendment also contained a penalty clause. If a state denied the right to vote to any of its male inhabitants, except for rebellion or crime, its congressional representation would be reduced proportionally. Although never enforced, the clause underscored the linkage between political rights and representation. Modern Supreme Court cases have recognized the breadth of this mandate. In the aforementioned Evenwell v. Abbott case at the beginning of this podcast, the court upheld Texas's use of total population, not just voter population, to draw legislative districts. Justice Ginsburg wrote, "By ensuring that each representative is subject to requests and suggestions from the same number of constituents, total population apportionment promotes equitable and effective representation." The court traced this principle directly to the 14th Amendment's drafting, noting that the framers of the 14th Amendment understood that maintaining equal representation required counting all residents. Ironically, the amendment's broad definition of persons gave former Confederate states more congressional seats than they had before the war, because formerly enslaved individuals now counted fully. However, without the effective enforcement of voting rights, this representation was wielded almost entirely by white electorates, contributing to the rapid rise of Jim Crow. This disconnect between representation and political inclusion remains a recurring theme in census controversies. The 14th Amendment established a broad constitutional mandate to count the whole number of persons, but the 20th century revealed how the mechanics of counting could still be contested and politically manipulated. By the mid-20th century, civil rights organizations began to highlight a persistent reality. The census systematically undercounted minority populations, especially African Americans in urban centers and rural poor communities. The 1940 Census Bureau acknowledged these errors, but treated them as an unavoidable byproduct of large-scale enumeration. By the 1960s, the stakes were clearer. Federal programs increasingly relied on census data to distribute billions in funding, from housing and education to transportation infrastructure. An undercount didn't just dilute political representation, it starved communities of resources. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund warned that undercounting black communities was a double disenfranchisement at the ballot box and in the budget. The Supreme Court's one-person, one-vote cases in the 1960s elevated the census's importance even further. In the 1964 Wesbury v. Sanders decision, Justice Hugo Black declared, "As nearly as is practicable, one man's vote in a congressional election is to be worth as much as another's." In Reynolds v. Sims, that same year, Chief Justice Earl Warren applied the same principle to state legislative districts, stating that the weight of a citizen's vote cannot be made to depend on where he lives. While neither case addressed the technicalities of census enumeration, both relied on census data as the population baseline. This effectively made the decennial count the foundation of representational equality. By the late 20th century, the Census Bureau explored statistical sampling as a means to correct undercounts, particularly among hard-to-reach populations. Democrats and civil rights groups generally supported the change, viewing it as a way to improve accuracy and equity. Republicans, however, opposed it, warning that sampling could be manipulated for partisan gain. The political divide was stark. Sampling would likely increase counts in urban, immigrant-heavy, and minority communities, constituencies that tended to vote Democratic. In 1999, the Supreme Court ruled in Department of Commerce v. United States House of Representatives that sampling could not be used for apportionment purposes, citing the Census Act's requirement of an actual enumeration. This decision preserved a status quo that critics argued perpetuated the undercount of marginalized population. The political takeaway was clear. Even neutral-sounding technical decisions about census methods could shift the balance of power in Congress and in the Electoral College. In 2018, the Trump administration introduced a controversial twist to the 2020 census by proposing a citizenship question. The official justification was to aid enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, but critics charged it would intimidate immigrant communities and produce severe undercounts. This concern was validated in the Supreme Court's Department of Commerce v. New York decision in 2019, where Chief Justice Roberts wrote that the Secretary's reasoning was contrived and violated the Administrative Procedure Act. The court stated, "Accepting contrived reasons would defeat the purpose of the enterprise." After that ruling, in July 2020, the administration attempted a different tactic. It issued a memorandum ordering that undocumented immigrants be excluded from the apportionment base. Legal challenges swiftly emerged, and a three-judge panel blocked the memo, reasoning that only Congress can define how many and which persons are counted for apportionment purposes. The Supreme Court later dismissed the case as premature, without resolving constitutional questions. In effect, both plans, whether through a citizenship question or executive memo, failed because they sought to redefine persons beyond historical and constitutional norms. Fast forward to August 2025, President Trump announced on Truth Social that he had, quote, instructed the Commerce Department to immediately begin work on a new and highly accurate census. People who are in our country illegally will not be counted in the census, unquote. This mid-decade census is being pitched as a redistricting tool to benefit Republican-held states amid ongoing efforts to redraw districts mid-cycle. Reports indicate that the proposal revives Trump's prior attempts and faces steep legal and political hurdles, given that only Congress can define census parameters and that the 14th Amendment and apportionment statutes demand counting the whole number of persons. Legal scholars and civil rights groups are poised to challenge the move, warning it would violate constitutional norms and undermine equal representation. As one expert summarized, if you don't count all people, you won't be able to provide equal protection to all people. Both the 2019 and 2025 efforts reflect a broader political strategy, altering census methodology to shift congressional power and federal funding. Undercounting undocumented immigrants, a group concentrated in Democratic-leaning, high-population states, would likely decrease representation for states like California, Texas, and New York, while increasing it for less diverse, largely Republican states. In 2019, the litigation over the citizenship question made clear that even seemingly technical changes can carry massive partisan consequences. Today, the stakes are even more immediate, as Trump's proposed mid-decade census could, if successful, reshape the 2026 elections by redrawing congressional boundaries based on a reduced population base, an unprecedented maneuver in modern U.S. politics. However, if there is one word that will be used to describe this administration in future years, unprecedented might be near the top of the list. So, what can we conclude from all of this? From the quills of the framers in 1787 to the digital data collection of the 21st century, the United States Census has never been a simple act of arithmetic. It is, and has always been, a contest over who belongs in the political community and how the spoils of representation and federal resources are divided. In the earliest years, that contest took the form of explicit constitutional exclusions: the 3/5 compromise for enslaved persons, the exclusion of Indians not taxed, and the political erasure of large swaths of the population. The 14th Amendment's apportionment clause was a landmark correction, declaring that the whole number of persons must be counted. But, as history has shown, the principle of counting everyone has been continually tested through undercounts, statistical disputes, and targeted efforts to exclude specific groups. The 20th century revealed that seemingly technical census decisions, whether to use sampling, how to address undercounts, or which questions to ask, carry profound partisan consequences. The civil rights movement reframed the census as a civil rights tool, essential for fair representation and equitable distribution of federal funds. The reapportionment revolution of the 1960s underscored that population equality in districts depends on accurate counts, further raising the stakes. Donald Trump's 2019 attempt to add a citizenship question and his current proposal to conduct a mid-decade census excluding undocumented immigrants fit squarely into this history of politicized counting. Both sought to redefine the apportionment base in ways that would shift representation and resources toward Republican-leaning states. The 2019 effort failed after the Supreme Court rejected the administration's contrived rationale. The 2025 proposal, if pursued, would face enormous legal challenges, not the least of which is the 14th Amendment's clear command to count the whole number of persons in each state. What makes the latest initiative especially consequential is its timing and ambition. By attempting to alter the count mid-decade, the administration is not simply influencing the next 10-year cycle. It is seeking to rewrite the political map in the middle of an electoral era, with potential impacts on the 2026 congressional elections and beyond. If successful, it would set a precedent for future administrations to manipulate the census as a weapon of partisan redistricting, eroding the stability and neutrality of one of the nation's oldest constitutional institutions. However, it may be an impossible uphill battle for the Trump administration. In an earlier episode of this podcast, we dove into the debate over birthright citizenship. And like that issue, here too Trump is trying to fight against 2 centuries of judicial precedent. That is akin to not just trying to row a boat against the current, but to trying to row the boat up a waterfall. But even if the court ruled tomorrow in his favor and told him he could proceed with a new census and new apportionment for the 2026 midterms, the thought of that process concluding its work in 15 months is laughable, considering the glacial pace things get done in the political world. Thus, it seems his attempt to change the census is a long shot at best. In the end, the census is more than a statistical portrait of the nation. It is the foundation of democratic representation. To change who is counted is to change who is seen, who is heard, and who has a seat at the table. That is why every fight over the census is, at its core, a fight over the meaning of we the people. That concludes this week's episode. If you find this podcast informative or entertaining, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen. The same goes if you tune in on YouTube. Also, if you have anything you would like to add to the conversation, or if there is a topic you would like to see covered on this show, please leave a comment. Until next time, remember this: get informed and fight to keep your political representatives accountable. Your freedom depends on it.